Welcome to edXL International GCE Economics Paper 1 of May 2017. This marking scheme and question paper is by Mytuition.lk. Let us begin. Answer all questions. The figure below shows the world market for coffee in 2014. From 2014 to 19, Chinese coffee consumption is expected to rise by 20%. On figure 1, draw the new demand curve showing the increase in coffee consumption in China. So normal demand curve, when consumptions are expected to increase, demand curve will shift to the right. On figure 1, label the new equilibrium of price and quantity. So this is the original demand curve and supply. When demand shifts to the right, there is a new demand curve with a new price and a new equilibrium, P1 and Q1. Briefly explain two factors that may have led to this expected rise in coffee consumption in China. So how can you assume that coffee consumption is going to rise? If there is a prediction about incomes that are going to rise, then increase in income meaning increase in consumption, like for instance coffee. Increase in advertising, if that is happening in the current years, it might slowly influence people to increase their consumption of coffee. Taste and fashion. If there is going to be changes in taste and fashion towards coffee consumption, then if people's preferences are towards it, there would be demand for coffee. The global PED for coffee is estimated to be minus 0.25. What is meant by PED? You define it. Suggest two possible reasons why global demand for coffee is inelastic. When you say minus 2.5, it means there is an inelastic demand for coffee. Why is coffee considered inelastic? Because till today there isn't a proper exact substitute for caffeine, right? So since there is no substitute, and thus there can be an inelastic demand, nothing to replace coffee, and coffee doesn't take a huge proportion of people's income. Therefore, people continue to consume coffee even if there is a price rise, because it's only a small proportion. And to many people, coffee is considered as a necessity. Some people are addicted to coffee. Therefore, they will continue demanding coffee regardless of the price rise, and that could be defined as inelastic demand for coffee. Next, Brazil is the world's largest coffee producer with approximately 220,000 coffee farms. The biggest plantations are mechanized and use of division of labor. It is estimated that number of Brazilians involved in coffee production is just over 5 million. Briefly explain two factors that may affect the demand for labor on Brazilian farms. So demand for labor in Brazilian farms comes from demand for coffee, right? So when increase in demand for coffee comes, to produce those coffee you will demand for labor, therefore there will be a derived demand. That's your first point. You explain that, or you can talk about how now they're talking about how it might affect demand, right? Or demand for labor might decrease as when people continue demanding for coffee consumption, there might be inventions of different machineries which can be used to replace workers, and machines being more cost effective, cheaper, and being able to work overtime, right? Because they don't get tired. Those will reduce the demand for labor. A next thing that would affect the demand for labor would be the productivity of each coffee producer. If their productivity is going to rise, their particular existence would be demanded by firms, but there won't be increase in demand for other coffee producers because they are itself productive. Why replace them? Why get more? They are productive themselves. So depending on the productivity, demand for labor might change. Next, briefly explain two factors that may affect the demand for labor on Brazilian coffee farms. Sorry, that's what we just discussed now. Firms will always benefit from division of labor. Discuss. So why will firms benefit from division of labor? When they start division of labor, they are getting each work to do only a small task. How they would benefit is each worker will be skilled at their task. Because they are skilled, they will save up time and do it faster, and there would be thus cost efficiency, bringing down the cost, and there will be time efficiency, bringing down the time taken. And since they are not doing a variety of tasks, there won't be time wasted switching from one product to the other. And because they are been doing it for so many years or so many months of doing the same job over and over again. They're probably more perfect at it and would increase their productivity and make less errors. And if each person is doing only a particular part of the production, they don't need the whole equipment of all the machinery, right? They only need a limited amount of tools. Therefore, the cost of machinery required also will decrease. In those ways, firm would benefit. You identify two of the many and you explain. How the firm won't benefit is when each worker has been doing it for so long, they will feel a strain. Repetitive work will make them feel bored and they will feel demotivated. And what would happen then? They will probably make more errors. They might not be so productive. They might slack off, or they might make wastages and so forth, or they might resist. So what is the conclusion? Division of labor depends on where it is being used, right? So in certain places division of labor is better to be used, in some other places it's not best to be used. So depending on the type of work, division of labor will benefit firms, and the firm should also try to take care of the problems of division of labor, for example boredom and wastages and stuff, in order to continue to benefit from division of labor. Next, in Nicaragua, the United Farm Workers Trade Union is campaigning to increase the wages of all coffee workers by 50% over the next 5 years. Apart from increasing wages, identify one other role. There it is listed. An increase in wages will always cause a fall in employment. Do you agree with this statement? Explain your answer. Like we have gone through in other past papers, when there is an increase in wages, that is, for instance, if there's a national minimum wage employed, what happens is the increased labor rate is not welcomed by employers. What they would do is make some workers redundant and increase the wages for the rest. Therefore, because of their profitability being affected, or because of their cost of production being affected, they might lay off some workers, and there would be unemployment for those workers. And if so many industries and so many firms do it, then yes, unemployment will rise. So now what they're saying is that increase in wage will always cause a fall in unemployment. That is not true, right? Now we were talking about the other side. Now to what extent will increase in wages actually lead to a fall in unemployment? That depends when firms decide to raise the price of workers but not make anyone redundant. They decide instead to pass on the cost to the customers. They can do that, right? Or if the workers decide to pay off the high wages with more productivity, employers will be pleased and retain the workers. Or if not, if the government subsidizes that particular firm for these increased wage rates, then the cost will be covered by government expense. Therefore, the cost won't be passed on to the customers, won't be borne by the firms. Therefore, employees may be retained. Therefore, it depends on how the increased wage rate is looked at it and how it is, taken by the firms, and depends on how much of government intervention and how firms react to price increases if the price is passed on to the consumers. So the conclusion you should be is it depends on the extent of wage rise, it depends on government intervention, and it depends on that elasticity of demand for the product, because if it's an elastic demand, passing on the benefits to the consumers will not be a positive result. Question 2. More than 30% of the Mexican population is very obese, is overweight, right? The increased consumption of sugary drinks had been held responsible for this problem. To reduce consumption, the Mexican government has added a 10% tax onto the price of these drinks. Briefly explain why obesity can create an external cost. Obesity means what? The entire nation is suffering from being overweight, meaning it causes a lot of problems like cholesterol, liver, and so forth. Which means government has to spend on more and more healthcare and building hospitals and getting skilled surgeons and so forth. Therefore, it is a national problem, right? And there is then an opportunity cost to the government. Why? It has to continue to spend on these healthcare and so forth. It will have less revenue probably to spend on maybe education, etc. Next, taxation is the best way to reduce external costs. Do you agree with this statement? Taxation is good to a certain extent, because when you tax, it reduces external costs if there's an elastic demand, because when the price increases, demand falls, and there will be less consumption when demand falls. Yet, sometimes tax is not effective if consumers choose tax over decreasing consumption, right? and if there is an inelastic demand, tax is not going to work. In that case, using other policies like legislation might work better. So your conclusion would be, it usually depends on what is the size of the tax, because if it's a big tax, then probably consumption is going to drop, right? And it depends on the elasticity of demand consumers have for the product, and it depends on the type of good that is taxed. For example, if it's a necessary that is being taxed, it's not beneficial in any way, because what would happen if they are taxing, for example, a necessity like water, uh, because due to certain external costs, because of firms overconsumption and so forth, what would happen is eventually consumers will decide to resort to imports that won't benefit the economy at all, right? So you should consider the good that is being taxed, and probably the best solution is using more than one policy to tackle the problem. Next, figure 2 shows the contribution by sector to Mexico's GDP. On the blank chart, draw and label the appropriate sizes. So they have told primary is only 4%, secondary is 3%, and tertiary is 63%. So primary, secondary, and tertiary. Next, I have given a different one too to show an alternative design. Next, give one example that's pretty easy. Figure 2b shows the labor productivity for Mexico from 2008 to 15, an enlarged picture of 2008 to 15 labor productivity. Okay, what is the question? Which of the following describes the overall trend? Overall trend is rise in labor productivity. Overall trend is rising. Briefly explain one reason for rising. If labor productivity is rising, it's probably because the employees there are using better technology to improve their output, or they have got better education so they know how to control wastages, or they receive training so that they can employ the resources more efficiently, or they're being given higher wage rises so they've been motivated to be efficient and productive, and so forth. Carlos Slim has been described as the world's richest man. He owns America Mobile, which has over 80% share of the Mexican telecommunications market. Then what is it? If there is more than 80%, it's a monopoly. Oligopoly is when there is like 60% of few large firms, right? Next, barriers to entry makes it impossible to firms to enter Mexican communication market. Consider one policy a government can introduce to improve competition. How might this policy be effective in achieving an increase in competition, such as the Mexican telecommunication market? So you choose one policy, talk about to what extent it will work, to what extent it won't work, and then your final conclusion. So if you choose, for example, subsidizing small firms, how will it work? If government provides subsidies for small firms to come and start up in that industry, competition is going to work. And when competition starts, it will compete with the large monopoly, the Mexican telecommunication, and then price would probably be then fluctuating. It won't be a fixed monopoly price, and it would benefit. To what extent it won't benefit? The small firms are relatively new, right? It will take a long time for them to establish themselves in the market. Will they be able to survive and become a large firm, or will they be kicked out by the monopoly in fierce competition? Is your evaluative point. Or if you take, for example, financial incentives, it depends on how it will work, but to what extent it won't work. If those firms become heavily dependent on financial incentives, what are they going to do if the government stops those incentives? Right? A better way would be probably setting strict regulations for uncompetitive prices, so that monopolizing is prevented in the market. Okay? Monopolies are always bad for the consumer. Do you agree? So monopolies can be bad because it's one large firm. They will benefit from revenue and stuff, but they will probably not give a choice because there is only one firm producing, and thus there is no competition to have prices at a reasonable price. What if they end up exploiting the customers because they are the monopoly, and since they have no competition, they might not focus on innovation and so forth. They might always not so be bad, because if they benefit from economies of scale, they might pass it on to the customers in form of cheaper costs. Since they are the only firm, they might earn a lot of revenue, and they can focus on R&D, research and development, and innovation. And if it's a natural monopoly, like for example the state owning the water system for the country, then they will be very reasonable in their prices because it's a government. So what's the conclusion? It depends on who is the monopoly, whether it's the private sector or the public sector, and how are they regulating the monopoly. Is there government regulations, and has there been regulations set for uncompetitive practices of the monopoly, and to what extent is monopoly exploiting the consumers? All those matter before you come to a conclusion. Question 3. Using the data in 3A, compare the GDP growth rate of Australia and France. So Australia over the years, France over the years. As you can see, Australia is on 2, and it has become 2.3 to 2.7 to 3.6, dropped again but picked up at 14 and dropped again a bit. France has gone to 2.1 to 0 to 0.8. France dropped dramatically in 2012, right? And then they are gradually picking up. So in both countries it hasn't become negative. Both of them are experiencing GDP, not a recession. Yet growth, you can see that both countries are struggling in their GDP growth rate, and France is really below is really below 2%. They are trying to achieve it, but they are far away from it. Australia has achieved more than 2, but they are slowly coming down. It is time for them to put more policies to increase GDP. Briefly explain one advantage and one disadvantage of economic growth. Advantage is when there is economic growth, people are demanding for more goods and services, which means they are earning higher income, which means when they demand for more goods and services, they can improve the standard of living. If more goods and services are being demanded, there is more demand for production, therefore unemployment would fall, then government can increase their tax revenue, and then the GDP of the country is going to rise, and so forth. Disadvantages would be there would be no conservation to the future. They might be using up all non-renewable resources. There's a lot of pollution that comes up from much production: air pollution, noise pollution, traffic congestion, ozone layer damage, global warming, etc. GDP is a useful measure of economic growth in a country. Discuss. So GDP, we have discussed this in earlier papers too. Why GDP is a useful measure of economic growth is that it takes into consideration all the goods and services produced in the country, and it gives instant information. That information is relatively easy to measure and easy to understand, and this can be used to compare the country's progress over the last 10 years or last 50 years and so forth, and see how much the country has improved in terms of their production, right? At the same time, this can be used to compare between countries to see where they stand in comparison to other countries. However, GDP calculations are subjective. Each country might include and not include certain goods and services. Therefore, can you actually compare with other countries might be questionable. Moreover, there could be hidden and grey economy, meaning there's a lot of things that are traded beyond the government's knowledge, and like cigarettes or alcohol or drugs, those are also goods and services, right? Whether they are banned and stuff is a different story. So those goods and services are not taken into account, so the calculation might not be right. Is the GDP adjusted for inflation? Those questions exist. So your conclusion would be GDP actually is still a very useful guide. It's used greatly by many countries, especially because you can compare your country's progress over the last few decades. Yet, making sure that you're using real GDP would be a benefit, and trying to be accurate as possible will make it more easier to use this. In the last 3 months of 2015, Australia had an inflation rate of 1.7%. So what is inflation? Inflation is a general rising price level and a fall in the value of money. If they ask you to define, you can rather say inflation is a sustained general rise in general price levels that causes in the value of money falling. Briefly explain two reasons why inflation may be bad for business. Inflation can lead to domestic demand dropping. Why? Consumers decide because of inflation we can buy less goods and services. Goods and services are expensive. Domestic demand drops. Same would happen for export demands. Foreigners will find the goods more expensive and export demand would drop. Then businesses are going to suffer, right? And then if they are suffering from inflation, then cost of production would rise, and when cost of production rises, it leads to cost push inflation, further giving rise to inflation. And when there's inflation, there's a lot of uncertainty in the market because firms don't know when will the prices of raw materials will rise again. Then they would be reluctant to make a proper move in their production process because of uncertainty, and that will make the industries uncompetitive. Next, according to the World Bank, Australia emits 18.6 metric tons of carbon dioxide per person. By comparison, UK emits 8.5 metric tons per person. So Australia is 18.6, UK is 8.5. Explain one method the Australian government could use to reduce its levels of pollution. What can the government do? They can tax the pollution, so polluting firms are taxed, or pollution firms are fined, or there is strict government regulations, or there could be pollution permits introduced in attempts to reduce pollution, or maybe the government can go positively, award them some sort of incentive for bringing down pollution. Then this is the unemployment rates by region in 2015 in Australia. What is the question though? Explain why unemployment rates might vary between regions. Is that so? Okay, so you can see it's not a constant unemployment rate. Some are low as 4, some are high as 7, some vary between 4 and 5. So they're asking why is there a variation? One reason is because different parts of the country will be focusing on different industries. So the different industry will obviously have different levels of unemployment. Some will be very saturated, some will have a lot of vacancies, some will have a lot of no vacancies but a lot of unemployment, a lot of supply of labor. So it depends on the different industries, right? And then so that's because some industries are on the rise, some are on the decline, and it could be due to structural unemployment. Sometimes it could be because some particular industry was specialized in maybe producing coffee, and due to international trade, maybe consumers switch to cheaper imports. Then that particular industry will start declining. So it depends on imports that are being used in those particular regions, and if these regions labor has been replaced by machinery. Okay. The most effective way to reduce unemployment in Australia is through use of fiscal policy. Do you agree? So you talk about to what extent fiscal policy is beneficial to reduce unemployment, to what extent it won't be, and you give your evaluation. So what is fiscal policy? Fiscal policy is using taxation and government spending. So fiscal policy through taxation, when government reduces taxes, what would happen? There is more income for consumers who can spend this income on more goods and services, which will stimulate unemployment to decrease and employment to increase, right? Because there would be more demand for production. Government spending increases means if the government spending on if the government starts spending for instance on training, what would happen? Unemployment would decrease because people are more skilled and firms would be willing to hire them. If government spending more on healthcare and education, what would happen is people, if it's free healthcare and free education, what happens is people will have to spend less on those costs, right? They have more money to spend on goods and services that will lead to more demand and therefore more production. If the government spends on education, then more people who leave school are educated and can easily join the workforce, which will bring down unemployment. If the government cuts down on corporate taxes, firms would be motivated to invest more on machinery and so forth and increase their production. But to what extent it won't be effective? It might cause inflation if the government keeps cutting down taxes because people might overconsume, right? Or if people spend their extra income on imports, it might not be effective because there will be more unemployment in the country. When there's government spending on training and so forth to increase a level of skills in these workers, there is an opportunity cost. The government could have rather spent it on infrastructure, right? So that is another problem. And if the government cuts down their taxes to increase levels of employment, the government will suffer from less revenue, right? And there will be less revenue available for funding. So what is your conclusion? It depends on what has caused this unemployment. You need to find out the root before tackling it through any policies, because to identifying what caused it will be better and more effective way to solve the problem, right? And the government should not use fiscal policy alone. Maybe using supply side policies along with fiscal policies would be beneficial to get a more effective result. Question 4. Statistics from the Vietnamese Ministry of Planning and Investment show that Vietnam attracted $22.8 billion in FDI in 2015. This was an increase of 12.4% compared to 2014. Okay. The largest single investor was Samsung, a South Korean MNC. Okay. Define FDI. FDI is money coming into one country by firms in other countries. Okay. Explain why MNCs such as Samsung might want to invest in Vietnam. These we have discussed earlier. When an MNC comes, it might look for new markets, it might look for greater market share, more consumers, or cheap factors of production such as cheap labor, or better transportation links, or access to raw materials, and so forth. Increasing FDI will always benefit a developing economy such as Vietnam. Do you agree? FDI would benefit because when they come and invest in another country such as Vietnam, they will employ the Vietnamese, therefore jobs will be created. When jobs are created, unemployment might fall and people's standard of living might increase, and that will contribute to GDP. People will have a much larger variety of goods to choose from, and due to if they have coming to another country, they will bring their technology, their information and so forth, which will be inflow, which will be benefit to the country, and the government can tax this MNC and have more benefits and use this government revenue to fund certain expenditure, right? But to what extent it might not benefit if this particular Samsung company or if any FDI investment ends up exploiting the labor by using child labor, or by not meeting up proper wages, by paying them low, or if they try to avoid tax, or if they overconsume their natural resources, or if they end up polluting the environment, those could be not benefits to the economy, right? So the conclusion would be MNCs are quite beneficial. The government must introduce strict regulations to ensure that they continue to only benefit from MNCs and not suffer from their existence. Next. In 2015, 12 Pacific Rim countries, including Vietnam and the US, signed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It is one of the most ambitious free trade agreements ever signed and will make trade among its member nations much easier by eliminating tariffs and other trade barriers. Explain the term free trade. Free trade is trade between countries without government intervention, restrictions, or interference. Explain 2 reasons why a country imposes tariffs. A country might impose tariffs to protect their domestic industries so that imports become expensive, so that imports are discouraged, and so that the domestic industries are protected and their jobs are protected. Explain one way in which Vietnam might benefit from free trade. When there is free trade, what happens? There is free flow of technology, information, ideas, so forth. At the same time, there could be cheap imports for consumers who can enjoy a variety, improve their living standards. Firms can import cheaper raw materials, bring in better technology, and so forth. Okay. So figure 4 shows the exchange rate for Vietnam dong to the US dollar between Jan 13 and Jan 16. So this is in Jan 2013 it was 2500, in Jan 16 it's 22,500. What has happened? amount of Vietnamese dong to pay for US dollars has increased. So earlier to get the Vietnam dong, they had to pay only 2,500. Now they have to pay 22,500 to get the same amount of Vietnamese dong. So what has happened? It has clearly, oh wait, did we misinterpret it? This says Vietnamese dong per US dollar. Okay, so okay, it's against the US dollar. I misunderstood. I'm sorry. I'll re-explain it. What has happened is the Vietnamese dong, earlier to get the US dollars, there you have to pay 22,500. Now to get that same amount of US dollars, you have to pay 22. Earlier they paid 2,500 for US dollars for an amount. Now they have to pay 22,500 for that US dollars. What has this mean? This means that the Vietnamese dong has depreciated against the US dollars. I hope I didn't confuse you. I'll repeat it again. What has happened is in 2013, to buy the US dollar, Vietnamese had to spend this much amount of their currency. But when they wanted to buy US dollars in 2016, they had to spend much more of their currency to buy the same amount of US dollars. Okay? With reference to figure 4, explain your answer. So yeah, like I told you, the explanation. Finally, a fall in the exchange rate of the Vietnamese dong will benefit Vietnamese firms. Do you agree with this statement? Give reasons for your answer. So when there is a depreciation of Vietnamese currency, will it benefit Vietnam firms? It may benefit Vietnam firms because depreciation in their currency means export demand is going to rise, because foreigners will feel that their currency has become cheaper, we can buy more goods, so let's buy more goods. So when export demand increases, export revenue increases, sales will rise, unemployment in the country will fall down because of increased demand, production will rise to meet this increased demand, GDP is going to rise, there would be economic growth, and then there will be more wages than paid to these workers, so their living standards will rise, and so forth. It's a huge vicious cycle, a virtuous cycle, right? However, to what extent might it not be beneficial? If Vietnamese are importing raw materials, right, depreciation will cause the imports to be very expensive, and then these expensive raw materials invested in their cost of production will increase the amount of cost of production, leading to an increase in their final prices, and then it will lead to cost push inflation. This might lead to drop in both domestic demand and export demand, because both people will find it expensive and they might resort to other countries' products. That will cause a huge negative impact on the Vietnamese firms' survival, domestic firms. So what is your conclusion? Extent of depreciation matters first, right? And it depends on whether you are importing raw materials or consumer goods. If you are importing raw materials, depreciation is a problem. But if you are importing consumer goods, then depreciation is not a problem, because depreciation will discourage imports because of its cost, and maintain a safety guard for their BOP, right? So most importantly, we should talk about the PED. If there is an inelastic demand for what they're going to import, then depreciation is a problem. If there's an elastic demand, it will benefit both the economy and unemployment of Vietnam. So that was the end of May June 2017 paper. I hope you benefited from this and it was a useful lesson. Thank you for being here. Let's meet again in the next paper.